today we're talking about the slow creeping demon engines of the Death Guard, and talking about what Plagueburst crawlers can achieve on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're continuing our series on Death Guard, with a review of the datasheet and rules for the Plagueburst crawler in Warhammer 40k. Now Games Workshop has slightly messed up my plans with the Death Guard series, announcing a new codex coming out fairly soon, which should be out in a couple of months' time. With that in mind, I might cover a few more Death Guard units, but save things such as unit comparisons and maybe more detailed things about characters and warlord traits until the codex is actually out. With that in mind, today we're going to be looking at Plagueburst crawlers. Hopefully sometime later in the week we'll get out a video on Blightlord Terminators, as that was one that a lot of people wanted to see as per the vote that we had on the channel's Patreon page. In this video we'll take a look at the datasheet for the Plagueburst crawler, talk about its war gear options, any obvious buffs and synergies out of the codex and the War of the Spider, and how I would think about using it in game. In the background, the Plagueburst crawler is a demon engine of Nurgle used by the Death Guard Traitor Legion, and designed by the Primarch Mortarion himself to outclass and obliterate similar Imperial artillery pieces. Mortarion had contempt for any live crew, even Death Guard Space Marines, that they might be injured or killed, so each Plagueburst crawler is in fact a demon engine, propelled solely by a demon or Nurgle, twisted, reshaped, and bound within the iron contraption. In battle, the Plagueburst crawlers are slow, lumbering assault tanks. The explosive Plagueburst mortar, for which the crawler is named, packs a powerful payload that's the bane of infantry and vehicles alike, and formations that suffer a sustained bombardment must also contend with the spore clouds that they unleash. These microscopic demon spores are inimical to life, and those that survive the explosive payload have every chance of succumbing to these powerful toxins. All very nasty, so let's see what they can do in game. Here we have the datasheet for the Plagueburst crawler. It is a heavy support choice for Codex Death Guard and will cost you 160 or 170 points depending on what you arm it with. At the time of recording, this thing costs £40 from Games Workshop, or a bit less from discount retailers such as Element Games that I have a link to down in the video description. They sell them for £34. Plagueburst crawlers might be just some of the toughest tanks in the entire game of 40k, and have a very powerful stat line indeed. They have a movement 9, weapon skill 6, ballistic skill 4, strength 7, toughness 8, 12 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8, and a 3+ save. That 3+ armor save is further protected by a 5+ invul save for being demonic, and it also has disgustingly resilient, so a 5+ feel no pain. Where, say, a similarly priced Leman Russ tank commander will on average be destroyed after 6 las cannon hits, the Plagueburst crawler will on average take more like 12. The combined effect of that feel no pain and that invul makes it very hard to shift indeed. In its top bracket it isn't even all that slow either, it's got a 9-inch movement, and its ballistic skill of 4+ isn't as much of a trouble in 9th edition, now you can move and shoot with heavy weapons at no additional penalty. Talking of heavy weapons, the Plagueburst crawler is armed with a Plagueburst mortar, a heavy slugger, and 2 plague spitters as default, and that loadout will cost you 170 points. The Plagueburst mortar is a pretty all-purpose weapon. It has a range of between 12 and 48 inches, is heavy d6, strength 8, AP -2 and damage d3, is a plague weapon for re-rolling wound rolls of 1, and is very helpful in having ignores line of sight, so we'll be able to target units that aren't visible to it. Don't get me wrong, its damage output isn't absolutely stellar. On average it's only doing about 1 or 2 wounds to a standard toughness 7 vehicle per turn, but it is quite good that it's effective against basically everything, so you can just focus it on exactly the enemy unit that most needs to die per turn. It could be pretty handy for clearing out some backfield infantry squads as well, if it will be helpful for clearing them off an objective. Its plague spitters are pretty much 9-inch range flamer weapons. They're assault d6, so you can use them after advancing should you want to. They're strength user, so strength 7 typically, although the strength does degrade as the unit takes damage, as you can see on the top right, but it's typically starting out at strength 7, AP -1 with a plague weapon to reroll those 1s, and it automatically hits the target. This thing will chew through enemy light infantry no problems at all, and can still put in some chip damage against heavier units as well if it needs to. You can swap those out for entropy cannons, which are 36-inch range heavy 1 weapons, strength 8, AP -4 and damage d6. Not really all that dissimilar from long-range melter weapons. Finally, that heavy slugger is a 36-inch range heavy 4 gun with strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, which can be traded out for a Rottail volley gun that's 24 inches, heavy 3, strength 6, AP -2 and damage 1. In terms of special rules, as we mentioned, it has disgustingly resilient, and also hateful assault for an extra attack on the first round of combat. It does explode, and explodes just a little bit easier than most tanks. When it's reduced to 0 wounds, it will blow up on the roll of a 5+, with models within 6 inches suffering D3 mortal wounds. Now that we can't reroll these dice with command points in 9th edition, it is just a little bit more of a liability if it's right in the middle of your forces. Typically though, it does take a lot of enemy firepower to bring one of these down, so if they are putting at risk of blowing it up, they have invested significant firepower in killing the thing. In general, point for point, the Plagueburst Crawler is a ridiculously tough tank with some reasonable general purpose damage dealing, but the slant is very much towards the durability. In terms of unit options, you have to decide between the entropy cannons versus the plague spitters, which really quite change the role of the tank in my mind. If you do go with the slightly more pricey plague spitters, then you're basically locking it into a more of an assault tank role, rumbling up the middle of the board, making the crawler an annoying threat the enemy can't really afford to ignore, killing light infantry with the flame weapons, and also taking pot shots with its other guns. If you prefer the tank to be a bit more of a sit back and shoot artillery piece, maybe babysitting an objective while other units of yours push forward, then you can consider those entropy cannons. They're a bit cheaper, and they will help you chip away at heavy enemy armour. Plus there's really quite a useful stratagem in the new War of the Spider book called Accelerated Entropy, where for 1 command point you can have one Plagueburst crawler both buff itself and any nearby Plagueburst crawlers, and it makes all of their entropy cannons a minimum damage of 3, and also makes them plague weapons so you can reroll 1s to wound. It's actually really quite a solid buff to their damage output. If you had 3 of them with entropy cannons also sat next to a Chaos Lord, then they're typically expected to do around about 8 or 9 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles each turn. With this accelerated entropy stratagem, that goes up to more like 11, so it can be a pretty reasonable way to boost their firepower. Using accelerated entropy can also make them plague weapons to allow Arch Contaminators to come into effect, allowing you to reroll wound rolls with those weapons. In general, I think both options are absolutely viable, and it just depends as to whether you want a durable, low damage dealing objective holder, or an annoying tank to move up the centre of the board and force your opponent to deal with it. The other option is to take the Heavy Slugger versus the Rot-Hail Volley Gun. Unfortunately, I don't think that these are very well balanced at all. I think that the Heavy Slugger is far better. It costs nothing, where the Rot-Hail costs 5 points, and has the extra shot and extra range, so I'd personally just take the Heavy Slugger. It's not really that big a deal either way, but I think that the Slugger is better. Now let's move on to talk about some combos and synergies for this Plagueburst Crawler then. In terms of character support, things could change a fair bit in the new codex, as I strongly suspect that the Plagueburst Crawler isn't going to be a core unit. At the very least, I suspect that this means that we're not going to get reroll 1s from it from Chaos Lords or Demon Princes. We're just going to have to wait and see. Until then though, that can be a way of buffing their damage output. You can also combine it with a Warlord such as a Demon Prince with the Arch Contaminator Warlord trait to allow it to reroll wound rolls with its plague weapons, which really does take it to the next level, as that's a really powerful buff. If you want even more durability, maybe on a Plagueburst Crawler that's advancing towards the enemy, then you could think about Miasma of Pestilence to make it -1 to hit, and even more of a pain to deal with. Beyond that, we know that this new Lord of Virulence model that they're coming out with for Death Guard alongside their codex will have some sort of synergy with demon engines. They haven't said what yet, but in the fluff he's the guy who commands the artillery and war machines, so I suspect he is going to buff Plagueburst Crawlers in some way. Finally, for characters, Plagueburst Crawlers can have some really powerful synergy with some Chaos Demon units. It does have both the Nurgle and Demon keywords, meaning that they're valid targets for several of their buffs. If Nurgle Demon units, which include the Plagueburst Crawler, slay a certain amount of enemy units, you can unlock all sorts of benefits, both major and minor, including reroll hit rolls of 1, boosted move, boosted strength, and quite importantly boosted toughness to make Plagueburst Crawler's toughness 9 if you manage to kill 5 enemy units. It can potentially be a very powerful combo in a Nurgle Demon Engines type list. You also have the option to use Poxbringers, which can cast psychic powers such as Miasma of Pestilence on them, and also make use of Fleshy Abundance to give them an extra D3 wounds healed, which can be pretty annoying for your opponent, particularly when they're quite so hard to take out in the first place. From War of the Spider, we got several options for plague companies of Death Guard, 2 of which have big themes with demon engines in the Inexorable and the Poxmongers. The Inexorable have a helpful stratagem for casting -2 to charge when an enemy unit tries to. Ferric Miasma can really throw a spanner in the works, particularly if they're charging out of Deep Strike. And they've also got the Warlord trait Ferric Blight, which means that when your Warlord is near an enemy vehicle, it makes all of your guns an extra AP -1 better against it. Can be quite helpful for upgunning things such as Plague Spitters or the Plagueburst Mortar. You can potentially also deck out a flighty character with the Leechpaw Casket. Say if you're advancing a Demon Prince alongside the Plagueburst Crawlers, then if he manages to kill models, for each model that he kills, a Plagueburst Crawler within 18 inches can regain a wound. Can be another very annoying healing mechanic. The other very solid option for demon engines are the Poxmongers, which I'd mainly think about taking for their excellent relic, the Ironclot Furnace. This Ironclot Furnace can go on any Death Guard character, and whenever the vehicles are within 7 inches of him, they have a 4+ invul save rather than a 5+. This is going to absolutely ruin the day for any decent AP weapons that are targeting the Plagueburst crawler, and just double down on them being incredibly obnoxious to remove no matter what is shot at it. When protected by this thing, you're looking at an average of 15 las cannon hits just to down one of them. There really aren't that many armies that are going to be able to do that. On top of that, they also have a couple of other useful stratagems in the bilious blood rush, which can allow you to shoot even if your vehicle fell back. Not bad if you want to be flaming something else with those plague spitters, or making sure that you still get to attack with that Plagueburst mortar. And also if the enemy does tie you up with some light infantry, and the Plagueburst crawler does kill one of them in the fight phase, even though he's hitting on 6s, then you will get to immediately regenerate D3 wounds for 1 command point. Probably not all that common that it's going to come up on the crawlers themselves, but if it ever did, then it could be quite a funny one to use. Finally, in terms of stratagems, we've already mentioned accelerated entropy, which I think is fairly decent. There's also putrid detonation, which is the one to auto-explode a demon engine of Nurgle, and this one can be particularly potent with the Plague Spitter version that's advancing forwards into enemy lines. There's a very good chance that enemy units might be swarming all over it and round it to try and get past and get at the rest of your army, and if they do manage to take it down, then it means that you can have some revenge with a whole bunch of mortal wounds all over the place. Auto-explode stratagems are just really good in 40k. Finally, if you're just struggling for a bit of range on those Plague Spitters, you can potentially use Overwhelming Generosity, which can add 6 inches to their range, and might be able to make the difference as to whether or not you can hit a light infantry unit with them and cause a lot of damage. So how would I go about using Plagueburst crawlers in game then? In general, I think that they're a unit that you ideally want your opponent to be shooting at if you can, just because if they're shooting at one of the toughest tanks in all of 40k, then it generally means that the best of your army is getting off pretty lightly. Whichever version that you're running, I think you just want to keep them dealing damage each turn, making themselves as much of a nuisance as possible, and capitalising on that ignores line of sight shooting with any Plagueburst mortars that you have, potentially allowing you to focus quite a lot of heavy firepower on any one unit on the map that most needs to die. For the entropy cannon version, I'd think about holding them back and maybe defending home objectives. You could potentially cluster them up using accelerated entropy and maybe arch contaminator for some real damage dealing, or you could just run them independently, just sit them on objectives and be safe in the knowledge that your opponent would have to deal a lot of damage to actually remove them from that objective and stop you scoring it. With the Plague Spitter version, I'd be moving them up as quickly as possible, maybe even thinking about advancing them if it's going to make the difference between whether you get those Plague Spitters in range or not. With their incredibly solid toughness, they can be the pinnacle of a nuisance unit, charging into enemy units, locking them up, stopping them charging what they want to, blazing away with those Plague Spitters both in close combat and out of it, and remembering to auto-explode if they need to when they die. Plagueburst crawlers do have a bit more competition for the sort of Death Guard demon engines that you might want to run now. Mephitic Blight Haulers took far less of a points increase than Plagueburst crawlers did, actually going down in points, so now they're an actual competitor and are perhaps going to be a little bit stronger in terms of damage dealing, particularly when their multi-melter gets a buff and gets 2 shots. They can also deal a bit more damage in combat as well, which might make you consider them a bit more for the role of charging forwards at the enemy and tying them up with a whole load of durable demon engines. Feated bloat drones can also somewhat fill the same niche. For me though, as the Plague Spitter version of the bloat drone costs 155 points, I think I'd generally rather have a Plagueburst crawler over that. I'd sacrifice an extra 15 points and the loss of some close combat ability for the massive increase in toughness and the very useful Plagueburst mortar. We also have some other options now in terms of defilers with the Contaminated Monstrosity stratagem to give them disgusting resilience, who again are a very solid option for the Death Guard, though do come at a command point cost. And if you want a fire support unit with a bit more of a slant on actually dealing damage as opposed to being very survivable, then Contemptor Dreadnoughts with Contaminated Monstrosity and las cannons will generally be a lot more dangerous than Plagueburst crawlers, but again there's a bit of a trade-off in them having less durability. Overall, at the moment, I would say that the Plagueburst crawler is a very potent unit for the Death Guard, and is very justified in seeing regular competitive play. Having a few powerful pieces that can deal decent damage and just won't die to any sort of reasonable firepower is a really intimidating thing to have on the other side of the table. If you have any other thoughts or insight as to using the Plagueburst crawler in games of 40k, please feel free to let me know down in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly be having more Death Guard content coming out over the next few months. Hopefully the next video should be on Blightlord Terminators. If you've been enjoying the series and would like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which you can find linked down in the video description. Making all these videos does take quite a bit of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons get to see one video early each week. There's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel. and you also get entry into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway each month with a chance to win some big kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for watching, and enjoy raining putrid death down on your foes.